Assalamu alaikum viewers. The topic of today's video is the difference between the state function and the path function. So what are state functions? State function are basically those quantities, the value of which depends only on the initial state and the final state of the system, and it does not depend on the path followed. This is to say that I have a system and I increase the pressure on that system. Increasing the pressure on that system will give a new state of the system, and that is a compressed state. And now, how this pressure has increased? It is the value of pressure does not depend on that. Okay, the value of pressure does not depend on how the pressure of the system is increased. It only depends on its initial and the final value. So state functions are those quantities whose value only on depends on the initial and the final value and does not depend on the path followed. So, example. What is example? The example is the pressure inside the inflated balloon. And for example, let's just say that you have a balloon and you blow air into that balloon. Whether the air is blown through a mouth or through an air pump, the pressure does not depend on that. The pressure only depends on the initial and the final state of its value. So, examples of the state functions are pressure, volume, temperature, and internal energy and enthalpy. And what are path functions? Okay, so what is path function? The path function are actually those properties of the system whose value depends upon the path followed. Okay, so it does not depend on its initial and the final value. It depends upon the path followed. Okay, it depends upon the sequence of step that takes the system from the initial to the final state. Okay, so this sequence of step is known as path, and heat and work are the examples of the path variables because these two quantities certainly depends upon the path followed, and there are also some other examples of the path function. So what really is the difference between the state and the path function is that the state function depends only on the initial and the final value, whereas the path function depends on the path followed. So we cannot determine path function from basically the initial and final value only. So you just need to know each single step that the path function has taken while reaching to the final state. Whereas in the state function, you just need to know the initial and the final value. Okay, so moving on towards this pressure volume diagram, as you can see here that along the y-axis is pressure and along the x-axis is volume, and this is a cyclic process. And as you can see here that the system is at the initial state, pressure P1, volume V1. After some time, the pressure is decreasing and the volume is increasing, and the system reaches another point at which the pressure has decreased to P2 and volume has increased to V2, and the system then compresses again, and then the volume decreases and pressure increases, and the system reaches again to its initial value. So in this cyclic process, as you can see that there is no change in pressure between the initial and the final state. As you can see here that the system starts from here and then ends again at this point. So there is no change in pressure and no change in volume. So change in pressure and change in volume will be zero. So I can say that the state function, for state function, the change in pressure and change in volume of a cyclic process is zero. Whereas if I talk about state function, let's just take an example of work. As you know that work is a state function. So in that case, when the system changes its initial, so changes from its initial value to another value and then goes back again to its initial value, then this is a cyclic process, and in that case work done will be equal to the area that is covered by this curve. Okay, the area that is covered by this figure. Okay, so let's just say another example here that, for example, if my pressure changes from this value to this value, means the pressure has decreased a lot and the volume has increased a lot, and then the system goes again to its initial value. Then as you can see here that the figure will cover more area, and in that case the work will be more as compared to this figure. This means that the work depends upon the path followed, whereas the pressure and volume does not depend upon the path followed. So in a cyclic process, when I take the change in state function, then that would be equal to zero. And whereas in a cyclic process, when I talk about some path function, then the path function will have some value, and that value will be equal to, for example, let's just talk about work, then the value of that work will be equal to the area that is enclosed by the curve. So that was all for today's video. If you have any question, you can ask in the comments.